You feel the rope tighten around your wrists. The wood beneath you is splintered, rough, soaked with the sweat and blood of men who came before. The horses lurch forward. Your back hits the cobblestones. Once. Twice. Every jolt tears skin from bone. The crowd's roar washes over. You like a wave, thousands of voices merging into a single howl of anticipation. They've come for a show. You are the show. The stench is unbearable, rotting meat, human waste, summer heat turned rancid. But underneath it all is something sharper, the metallic promise of what's coming. This isn't an execution. This is theater. And you're not meant to die quickly. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It honestly amazes me how a story this brutal, from so long ago, still pulls us all in from every corner of the globe. August 23rd, 1305. London. The city has been preparing for days. Carpenters hammered scaffolds into place at Smithfield. Vendors set up stalls selling ale and roasted meat. Mothers brought their children. This wasn't just a crowd, it was an audience. And the man they came to see destroyed was William Wallace, a Scottish rebel who had humiliated the most powerful monarch in Europe. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, didn't just want Wallace dead, he wanted him erased, dismantled, turned into a warning so visceral that no one would ever dare challenge English authority again. What happened that day wasn't justice. It was revenge dressed in the language of law, and it would become one of the most infamous executions in medieval history. But to understand why Wallace died the way he did, we need to go back. Back to when he was nobody. Scotland in the late 1290s was a kingdom without a king. Alexander III had died suddenly, his heir a child who would die shortly after. The throne sat empty. Nobles bickered. Clans fought. And into that chaos walked Edward I of England, a man who believed Britain should be one kingdom under one crown. His crown. Edward was tall, commanding, and devastatingly intelligent. He didn't conquer with brute force alone. He conquered with contracts, legal claims, carefully constructed justifications that made invasion look like diplomacy. He positioned himself as Scotland's protector, the impartial judge who would help them choose a new king. It was a lie wrapped in parchment and sealed with wax. By 1296, English soldiers occupied Scottish castles. English laws replaced Scottish customs. Scottish nobles, one by one, bent the knee, some out of fear, some out of pragmatism. All of them understood the cost of resistance. And in this landscape of submission, William Wallace was invisible. He was the youngest son of a minor knight. No land, no title, no inheritance. History didn't bother recording his birth. He was, by every measure that mattered to medieval society, irrelevant. Until he wasn't. In 1297, English soldiers killed someone Wallace loved. The records don't agree on who. His father, his brother, some say his wife. What matters is this. Something inside him broke open, and what poured out was a rage so pure it couldn't be negotiated with. Wallace didn't raise an army. He raised hell. He gathered outlaws, farmers, younger sons like himself, men with nothing left to lose. And on September 11th, 1297, at a narrow bridge near Stirling, Wallace did the impossible. The English army was professional, well-armed, confident. They began crossing Stirling Bridge in formation, funneling onto the narrow stone structure. Wallace waited. He let them come. And when enough English soldiers were trapped on the bridge, caught between the river and the Scottish spears, he struck. The slaughter was total. Thousands of English soldiers died. The survivors fled in chaos. And the man who led them, John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, ran so fast he didn't stop until he reached the safety of English soil. Edward I had been humiliated, not by a rival king, not by a noble house, by a nobody. A ghost with a sword and a grudge. For a brief, shining moment, Scotland tasted freedom. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland. He raided northern England. He wrote letters to European merchants declaring Scotland open for business under his protection. He acted like a king without ever claiming the title. And Edward I, still reeling from the defeat, began planning his response. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be merciful, it would be absolute. By 1304, the tide had turned. Edward returned to Scotland with overwhelming force. Castles fell. Nobles who had rallied to Wallace switched sides again. One by one, Wallace's allies melted away. He became a fugitive, moving through forests and highlands, sleeping in different places every night, never staying long enough to be caught. For 7 years, he was a ghost, the most wanted man in Britain, and yet he slipped through every trap, until he trusted the wrong man. Sir John de Menteith was a Scottish knight. He'd fought alongside Wallace, shared meals with him, knew his habits, his hiding places, his weaknesses. And when English gold was offered, Menteith made a choice. Near Glasgow in August 1305, Wallace was betrayed. There was no battle, no heroic last stand, just ropes, chains, and the cold finality of capture. Scotland's greatest defender was now England's prize. Wallace's journey to London took weeks. He was paraded through English towns like a carnival attraction, bound and filthy, displayed in market squares while crowds jeered and threw garbage. He was stripped of dignity long before they stripped him of life. But here's the thing the English couldn't break: his silence. He didn't beg, didn't plead for mercy, didn't offer to switch sides for clemency. He just stared back at every face in every crowd, as if memorizing them, as if bearing witness to his own humiliation in a way that made the humiliators uncomfortable. On August 23rd, Wallace was dragged into Westminster Hall for trial. It was theater. The verdict had been written before he arrived. He was charged with treason, with murder, with sacrilege. The judges read the charges like a script, and when they called him a traitor to King Edward, Wallace spoke. His voice cut through the hall. "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign. He never received my homage. And whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." It was the last act of defiance from a man who had already lost everything except his voice, and it sealed his fate. The sentence was read aloud: hanged by the neck, but not to death; cut down while still conscious; disemboweled, his intestines pulled out and burned before his eyes; then beheaded; then quartered; his body divided into 4 pieces and sent to the corners of Scotland as a warning. This wasn't punishment. This was a meticulously designed ritual of degradation, meant to destroy not just the man but the very idea of resistance he represented. The morning of the execution, London woke early. By dawn, Smithfield was packed. Vendors sold food. Families claimed spots near the scaffold. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. The executioner tested the sharpness of his blade. Everything was ready. Wallace was tied to a wooden hurdle, a crude frame meant to be dragged behind horses. He was naked, his body already covered in cuts and bruises from the journey, and as the horses pulled him through London's streets, the cobblestones tore fresh wounds into his back. Every lurch of the horses opened new gashes. Blood streaked the stones behind him like a grotesque trail marking his final journey. The crowd followed, a river of humanity flowing toward Smithfield, hungry for the spectacle they'd been promised. Some threw refuse. Others shouted insults. A few simply stared, caught between fascination and horror. The journey from the Tower to Smithfield was over 4 miles. 4 miles of degradation. 4 miles of public humiliation. By the time the horses stopped at the scaffold, Wallace's back was a mass of torn flesh and exposed muscle. At the scaffold, Wallace was hoisted up. A rope was looped around his neck. He was hanged, but only until his face turned purple, until his body convulsed and his eyes began to roll back. The executioner watched carefully, timing it perfectly. Too long, and Wallace would die. Too short, and he wouldn't suffer enough. When the moment was right, they cut him down. He hit the wooden platform hard, and he was still breathing. What happened next is almost impossible to write. The executioner drew a knife. He opened Wallace's abdomen with a single long cut. Wallace's eyes were open. His mouth moved, trying to form words, trying to breathe through the agony. The executioner reached inside. One by one he pulled out Wallace's intestines, held them high for the crowd to see, and then threw them into a fire that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. Wallace watched, his own body being consumed by flames while he was still alive. Some in the crowd cheered, others turned away. A few were silent, faces pale, realizing they were witnessing something that would haunt them forever. The executioner worked methodically. He wasn't rushing. This was his craft, performed before thousands, and every motion was deliberate. Wallace's heart was cut from his chest, still beating in the executioner's hand for a few seconds before being cast into the flames. His lungs followed. Each organ was lifted high, displayed like a trophy, then thrown into the fire. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the summer air. Witnesses would later write that they couldn't eat meat for months after, that the memory of that smell invaded their dreams, that they saw Wallace's face every time they closed their eyes, that expression of agony frozen in their memories. Through it all, Wallace remained conscious. Medical knowledge of the time meant the executioner knew exactly how to prolong life during the disembowelment, which organs could be removed without causing immediate death, how to avoid major arteries that would lead to quick blood loss. This wasn't butchery. It was precise, calculated torture performed by a man who had done this many times before. The crowd fell quieter as the execution progressed. Even the most bloodthirsty spectators began to realize they were watching something beyond normal human cruelty. Finally, when Wallace's breath became shallow gasps, when his body had given everything it could, the executioner raised his axe. One clean stroke. Wallace's head separated from his body and fell into a waiting basket. The crowd released a collective breath. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stood in stunned silence. But even death wasn't the end. The executioner took his knife again, this time cutting through joints and bone. Wallace's arms were removed, his legs severed, his torso divided. Blood pooled on the scaffold, dripping through the wooden slats onto the ground below, where dogs lapped at it. Wallace's head was dipped in tar to preserve it. Then it was mounted on a spike and placed on London Bridge, where it would remain for years, staring out over the Thames with empty eyes. His right arm was sent to Newcastle, displayed at the town gate where every traveler entering would see it. His left arm went to Berwick, hung from the castle walls. One leg was sent to Stirling, the site of his greatest victory, a cruel irony not lost on the Scots who saw it. The other went to Perth. These weren't random destinations. They were carefully chosen, a map of terror, a warning etched in flesh. Edward had ordered that Wallace's remains be placed at the four corners of Scotland, so that every region would see what happened to those who defied English rule. King Edward believed he'd won. He thought that by destroying Wallace so completely, so publicly, he would kill the rebellion itself. He was catastrophically wrong. Wallace's death didn't silence Scotland. It ignited something deeper. His quartered body became a rallying point. In every town where his remains were displayed, whispers started. In taverns, in churches, in the fields where men worked, they talked about the man who refused to kneel, about the way he'd looked his executioners in the eye, about his final words in Westminster Hall. The Scottish nobles who had bent to Edward began to feel something they'd tried to bury. Shame. And shame, when it festers long enough, turns into action. But what he didn't have, until Wallace's execution, was a symbol powerful enough to unite a fractured nation. Wallace's death gave him that. It gave Scotland a martyr whose story was too powerful to suppress, too visceral to forget. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Bruce led the Scots to a decisive victory against English forces. As the armies clashed, soldiers on the Scottish side shouted Wallace's name, not as a prayer, as a promise, a reminder of what they were fighting for and what they were fighting against. He, man who had been torn apart piece by piece, had somehow become the glue holding Scotland together. His dismembered body had created a unified spirit. Edward I had tried to erase Wallace from history. Instead, he'd carved him into it permanently. The execution that was meant to terrify became a story of defiance. The body parts meant to warn became relics of resistance. Every battlefield where Scottish soldiers fought, they carried Wallace's memory. Every negotiation, every treaty, every moment of doubt, someone would remember the man who was dismembered but never broken. His execution became Scotland's founding trauma and its rallying cry. But without his fall, Scotland might never have risen. His death was the spark. His refusal to submit, even as they tore him apart, became the story mothers told their sons. The story soldiers whispered before battle. The story that wouldn't die no matter how many pieces they cut him into. In 1328, Scotland's independence was formally recognized by England in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. Wallace had been dead for 23 years. His head had long since been removed from London Bridge. The flesh rotted away, the skull likely thrown into the Thames and lost to history. But by then, it didn't matter. Wallace had already become something England could never kill. An idea. A ghost that walked through Scottish history, reminding every generation that some things are worth dying for. That submission isn't the same as survival. There's a line in the Scottish Chronicles, written decades after Wallace's death by an anonymous monk. It says simply, "He taught us that a man is not measured by what he gains, but by what he refuses to surrender." The chronicler doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. Everyone reading it knew exactly what he meant. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen where his body parts had hung. They understood the price of defiance and the cost of freedom. On that summer day in 1305, thousands of people watched William Wallace die. They saw his body destroyed in stages. They smelled his burning flesh mixing with London's summer heat. They heard the crowd's roar turn to uneasy silence. They witnessed the most brutal execution medieval England could devise, a punishment specifically designed for high treason, reserved for those who threatened the very foundation of royal authority. And they thought they were watching the end of a rebellion, the final chapter of Scotland's resistance. They were witnessing the birth of a legend, because legends, once born in blood and defiance, never truly die. They just wait, in the stones of old castles, in the names of mountains and rivers, in the stories passed from one generation to the next, evolving, growing, becoming more powerful with each telling. Wallace's body was scattered across Scotland, but his spirit was never divided. It grew in every place his remains were sent, spreading like roots through soil until the entire nation was connected by the memory of a man who refused to bow. They thought they could break him by tearing him apart. They only proved that some men can't be broken, not by ropes, not by fire, not by the sharpest blade or the cruelest king. Edward I died 3 years after Wallace, still dreaming of a unified Britain under his control. That dream died with him. Wallace's dream lived on, carried forward by men who had witnessed what defiance cost and decided it was a price worth paying. In the end, the question isn't how William Wallace died. We know how he died. We know every horrifying detail, preserved in chronicles and legal documents, recorded with the meticulous precision of medieval bureaucracy. The question is what his death created, and the answer is written in every moment of Scottish independence that followed, in every act of resistance against impossible odds, in every person who looks at overwhelming power and says simply, "No." William Wallace was torn into pieces and scattered across a kingdom. But Scotland, watching what was done to him, became whole. His execution was meant to be the end of hope. Instead, it became the beginning of a nation. And that might be the most horrifying thing of all, at least to those who ordered his death, that their perfect act of terror created exactly what they were trying to destroy, that in trying to kill an idea, they made it immortal.